There are kitchens that have never been forgotten, even when the people who cooked in them are long gone. You can still smell them if you close your eyes: wood smoke, rendered fat, something slow and warm sitting on a stove that never really went cold. Cornbread made in the pan drippings. The first thing you have to understand about old cornbread is that it was not sweet, and it was not made in a loaf pan, and it had nothing to do with the boxed mixes that line the grocery store shelves today. It was made from coarsely ground cornmeal, sometimes water and salt and nothing else, pressed into a cast iron skillet that already held a thin layer of hot grease from whatever had been cooked in it last. Bacon drippings, lard, sometimes just fat rendered off. A piece of salt pork that morning. The skillet went directly into the oven of the wood stove, or it sat right on top of the iron if the oven wasn't drawing heat well that day. The bottom went dark and crisp. The inside stayed dense and satisfying in a way that modern cornbread, all soft and cakey, never quite manages. A wedge of it could hold a man through a full morning of field work. Crumbled into a glass of buttermilk at the end of the day, it was supper. Just that. Just cornbread and buttermilk in a glass, and it was enough. Dried bean soup, with ham hock dried beans, were among the most important foods in a poor family's pantry because they lasted indefinitely on the shelf. They cost almost nothing, and when you cooked them long enough over a slow fire, they became something genuinely nourishing. A ham hock, the knuckle end of a cured pig's leg, mostly bone and collagen and a little fat, went into the pot first, simmered for hours in plain water until the broth turned cloudy and rich. Then the beans went in. Navy beans, pinto beans, whatever was on hand. They cooked all day, sometimes from early morning until the family sat down at dusk, the steam gathering on the kitchen windows, the smell settling into the walls. The ham hock gave up everything it had. By the end, there was almost nothing left of it, but the soup was thick and deeply savory and filling in a way that settled into your bones. It was the kind of food that made the cold outside feel like it had less authority over you. Hoe cakes before there were skillets in every kitchen, before proper stoves. People cooked cornmeal cakes on the flat blades of hoes held over open fire. That is where the name comes from, the literal tool of the field, turned into a cooking surface because necessity transforms everything. By the time most families were cooking hoe cakes in the early and mid-20th century, the hoe had been replaced by the griddle or the skillet, but the cake itself had not changed much. Cornmeal mixed with water and a little salt, patted flat with the hands, laid onto a hot greased surface. They crisped at the edges first and puffed just slightly in the center. They were eaten plain, or with whatever was being eaten alongside. A pot of greens, a bowl of beans, sometimes just the hoe cake alone when there was nothing else. They were fast, which mattered when the fire was already going for something else, and you needed to add something to the table without burning more wood than you had to. Pot liquor and bread when a big pot of greens had been cooking for a long time. Collard or turnip greens or mustard greens. The liquid left at the bottom of the pot was called pot liquor. It was green-tinged, slightly smoky from the salt pork or ham that had cooked with the greens, deeply savory, and full of whatever vitamins the greens had surrendered to the long simmer. People drank it from the bowl. They soaked their cornbread into it. They gave it to young children who weren't yet old enough to chew through the tough greens themselves. Nothing in that pot was wasted. The greens were eaten. The pot liquor was drunk. The bone or salt pork that had flavored everything was picked clean. Families who grew up on this kind of cooking had an intuitive understanding that food was not decorative, that every part of it carried value, that throwing anything away was a kind of small extravagance they couldn't afford. Crackling bread when a hog was slaughtered. And in many rural communities, this happened once a year, usually in the fall once the weather had turned cold enough to slow spoilage. The fat was rendered down in a large iron pot over a slow fire. The skin and scraps left over after the lard had been pressed out were called cracklings. They were small, crisp, intensely porky, with a texture somewhere between a very firm chip and something that gave your jaw a little work to do. Mixed directly into a plain cornbread batter and baked in a hot skillet, they became crackling bread, something richer and more satisfying than ordinary cornbread, with pockets of salty, fatty crunch throughout. It was a seasonal food, made in the weeks right after hog killing when the cracklings were fresh. Families looked forward to it, the way other families might look forward to a holiday meal, because it represented a brief abundance after a long, lean stretch. Cornmeal mush. There are mornings that ask nothing complicated of you. Cornmeal mush was the food for those mornings. Ground cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling salted water, cooked until it thickened to the consistency of soft porridge, then poured into bowls and eaten warm, plain, sometimes with a drizzle of molasses if the family had it, sometimes with a little butter pressed into the center, watching it melt. What was left in the pot, and there was always something left, was poured into a pan and left to cool and solidify overnight. By morning it had set firm enough to slice. Those slices went into a skillet with a little lard, and were fried until they were golden and crisp on both sides. That was supper sometimes. Fried cornmeal mush, reborn from yesterday's breakfast, feeding the family a second time without costing anything more. Black-eyed peas and rice. In the American South, black-eyed peas cooked with rice were called Hoppin' John on New Year's Day, a dish supposed to bring luck and prosperity in the year ahead. But the truth is that peas and rice together were not a once-a-year thing. They were an everyday thing, a survival thing, cooked throughout the year in households where the combination of legume and grain made a complete and filling meal from two of the cheapest ingredients a family could keep in the house: a piece of smoked pork, salt pork, ham hock, bacon end pieces went into the pot with the peas cooked until tender, the rice added toward the end to absorb the liquid and soak up the smoky flavor. Eaten in a bowl together, the peas soft and savory, the rice slightly stained from the broth. It was humble and satisfying and honest in a way that food made from nothing but necessity often is. Fatback and rice. Fatback was not bacon. It had no lean meat running through it, no stripes, no sweetness from the cure. It was simply salt-cured pork fat, sliced from the back of the hog, kept in the pantry, wrapped in cloth or in a covered crock. It was the flavoring agent in an enormous amount of poor Southern cooking. It went into the bean pot, into the greens pot, into the skillet before anything else started frying. But it was also eaten directly, fried hard, until the slices curled and most of the fat had rendered out of them, laid on top of a bowl of cooked white rice. The rice soaked up the rendered fat and took on its saltiness. It was not elegant. It was a meal assembled from the bottom of the pantry when other things had run short. Families who grew up eating it sometimes felt embarrassed by it later in times of greater prosperity, and some of those same families, much later in their lives, found themselves craving it with an intensity they couldn't quite explain. Dried pea soup. Split peas, dried, shelled, pale yellow or green depending on the variety, cooked down into a thick, almost velvety soup when given enough time and heat. They didn't need soaking the way whole dried beans did. They simply went into the pot with water and whatever flavoring was available: a ham bone, a smoked hock, a few strips of salt pork, and cooked until they fell apart entirely and surrendered themselves to the liquid around them. The resulting soup was thick enough to stand a spoon in, deeply satisfying, in the way only slow-cooked foods can be, and kept well at the back of the stove, where residual heat from the wood fire maintained it through a long day. Families who kept a perpetual pot going, always something simmering at the back of the stove, always something ready to be ladled out, understood this food as both meal and insurance. As long as the pot wasn't empty, no one went hungry. Fried salt fish before refrigeration made fresh fish accessible to people who didn't live near water. Salt-preserved fish was one of the few animal proteins available to poor families far inland. Salt cod, dried and packed in wooden boxes, kept almost indefinitely in a cool pantry. Salt herring, packed in brine in barrels, lasted through entire winters. The preparation always began the night before, the fish submerged in a pan of cold water. The water changed several times to draw out the excess salt. The fish softened back toward something approximating its original texture. Then it was fried in lard, in bacon drippings, whatever fat was available, until the edges went crisp and the flesh flaked apart easily. Eaten with cornbread or boiled potatoes or whatever grain. Filled out the plate, salt fish was dinner for generations of families who never once questioned whether it was enough. It was what there was. That was the whole conversation. Grits cooked slow on the back of the stove. There is a wrong way to cook grits, and it involves rushing. The right way, the old way. The way grandmothers cooked them on wood stoves where temperature was a slow and negotiated thing, was to let them sit at the back of the stove for as long as they needed, stirring whenever you passed by, adding water or milk a little at a time when they started to thicken too fast. Stone-ground grits, coarser and more flavorful than anything commercially processed, took an hour or more to cook properly. What you ended up with was soft and slightly chewy, and tasted genuinely of corn in a way that instant grits, done in 3 minutes in a microwave, simply do not. A bowl of them with a little salt, and a scant spoon of lard melted in was breakfast. With the addition of leftover meat or a fried egg, they became dinner. On the wood stove, they were never a burden to cook. They just sat there and did their work while the family did theirs. Ash cakes. This is one of the oldest preparations on this list. Older than cast iron, older than proper stoves, rooted in the period before many families had much in the way of cooking equipment at all. Cornmeal mixed with water and salt, patted into a flat round, wrapped in wet corn husks or cabbage leaves, or simply pressed directly against the hot ash at the edge of a dying fire. The outer layer charred and was peeled away. Inside was something cooked through and slightly smoky and dense. It was not refined. It was not meant to be. It was the food you made when you had fire and cornmeal and nothing else, when the stove wasn't working or wasn't available or simply hadn't been built yet. Some families made ash cakes well into the 20th century, not because they lacked better options, but because the old ways stayed with people long after circumstances changed. Pone bread. Corn pone was the older cousin of cornbread, simpler and more austere. No eggs, no buttermilk usually, just cornmeal, water, salt, and fat mixed by hand into a stiff dough, then shaped into small ovals or round patties, and either baked on a greased pan or fried in a skillet. The texture was denser than any modern cornbread, and the crust was thicker, and the taste of corn was more pronounced because nothing else was competing with it. It filled you efficiently, without pretense. Some pone was made in large batches and eaten over several days, reheated near the fire or eaten cold when there wasn't time for anything else. It was working food, traveling food, the thing a field worker put in his pocket in the morning and ate at midday with nothing but his hands and whatever water was nearby. Chicken feet soup, nothing from the hog or the chicken, was wasted in households where money was short and resources were scarce. Chicken feet, the yellow, clawed, cartilaginous feet that modern groceries often don't carry at all, went into the soup pot the way any bone goes in, to give the broth body and flavor. They are made almost entirely of collagen, and when cooked long enough over low heat, they break down and make a broth so rich it gels solid when it cools. Onions, whatever vegetables were in the garden, a handful of dried herbs, salt, maybe a little dried corn. The soup built itself slowly around the feet over the course of a long afternoon. The feet were often eaten too, pulled from the broth and the softened cartilage chewed off carefully. It sounds like very little, but the broth it produced was deeply nourishing in the way that only long-cooked, collagen-rich things are, and the soup it anchored was filling and warming and honest. Souse meat after a hog was killed and the good cuts had been set aside. The hams for smoking, the loins for roasting, the fat for rendering. What remained were the scraps and the head and the feet, the parts that didn't fit neatly anywhere else. These became souse. The head was split and cleaned, the feet scrubbed, the ears trimmed, and everything simmered for hours in heavily salted water with vinegar and pepper and sometimes dried herbs. When the meat had given up everything it had and fallen away from the bones, it was picked carefully, shredded or chopped fine, and packed into a loaf pan, or a crock covered with strained cooking liquid and pressed with a weight as it cooled. The gelatin in the broth set the whole thing solid overnight. Souse was sliced cold and eaten with vinegar and crackers or cornbread. It was a way of preserving the last of the hog's gift, stretching the aftermath of the slaughter into weeks when nothing new was coming from outside. Molasses bread molasses was not a luxury ingredient. It was the cheapest sweetener available. To poor families, the dark byproduct of sugar refining that was sold cheaply precisely because it wasn't white sugar, because it was darker and more intensely flavored, and therefore less desirable to people who associated pale color with refinement and purity. But mixed into a bread dough, flour, lard, a little baking soda, molasses, water. It created something that was rich and deeply flavored and sweet enough to feel like a treat even when it wasn't meant to be one. Baked in the wood stove, it came out dark on the outside, moist inside, with a heady sweetness that filled the whole kitchen. A thick slice of it, spread with a little butter if there was any, was what you gave a hungry child when there was nothing else to give. It kept well for several days. It was dense enough to actually satisfy a hunger, not just distract from one. Vinegar pie when there was no fruit. In the house, no apples stored away, no dried berries, no preserves left in the cellar, but there was still a need for something. That felt like pie, like a small gesture towards sweetness and normalcy. Families made vinegar pie. It sounds wrong. It sounds like something that couldn't possibly be good. But the filling was made from eggs, sugar, butter, flour, water, and a measured splash of cider vinegar. And when it baked in the crust, a plain lard crust, the kind that requires only fat and flour and cold water, the vinegar tempered the sweetness and gave the filling a faint tartness that mimicked the acidity of fruit. It wasn't lemon pie, wasn't apple pie, wasn't anything it pretended to be. But it was dessert, and dessert meant that even in a difficult week, the meal had ended with something that resembled care. Children remembered vinegar pie with surprising warmth decades later, not because it was particularly delicious, but because of what it represented, that their mother had found a way. Dried apple stack cake in the mountain regions of Appalachia. Dried apples were the currency of hospitality. Fresh apples didn't keep through the winter, but sliced thin and dried on wooden racks in the warm weeks of autumn. They kept for months, rehydrating beautifully when simmered with sugar and spice, and just enough water to soften them back to something resembling a preserve. Stack cake was made from thin gingerbread layers, cooked flat in a skillet or a shallow pan, more like a soft cookie than a traditional cake, stacked with the reconstituted apple filling spread between each layer. The whole thing was wrapped or covered and left to sit overnight, sometimes longer, the filling softening the layers gradually, until everything melded into something completely different from what it had been when first assembled. At a wedding or a gathering, neighbors each brought a layer, and the height of the finished stack was a kind of measurement of how loved you were. In a hard week at home, it was made more modestly, just a few layers, just enough dried apple to fill between them, just enough sweetness to make a Thursday feel less like survival and more like living. Sweet potato pone, sweet potatoes stored well in a cool cellar, or buried in a sand box away from frost. They were sweet already, and starchy, and filling in the way that only dense root vegetables can be. Pone made from them, grated raw sweet potato mixed with eggs, molasses, butter or lard, spices. A little flour to bind, baked slowly in a pan in the wood stove until it set firm and the top went a deep, glossy brown. It was somewhere between a pudding and a bread, somewhere between dessert and a proper dish, and families ate it in both roles depending on what else was on the table. The sweetness was natural and warm rather than sharp. The texture was dense and satisfying. It could be made entirely from things kept in the root cellar and the pantry shelf, with no trip to a store required, which meant it was available in the middle of winter when roads were impassable and credit at the general store had run out. Chitlins. This is a food that carries history in every direction. Chitlins, the small intestines of the hog, cleaned laboriously, simmered for many hours, were the cuts. That remained once everything more desirable had been distributed to others. In the American South, they became central to African American foodways precisely because enslaved people were given the parts of the hog that slaveholders considered beneath their table. The preparation was demanding. The cleaning alone took hours. The smell during cooking was formidable, and the patience required to simmer them long enough to become tender was the kind of patience that only comes from necessity. Eaten with hot sauce and vinegar and cornbread, they were intensely savory and rich in the way that organ meats always are. Families who grew up eating them understood them as more than just food, as a part of their identity, a thing that had been made from very little by people who had very little, and transformed into something worth gathering around. Lard biscuits, there was a time when every kitchen had a lard can, and the lard in it was rendered at home from the fat of a hog that had been killed that autumn. Commercial lard came later and was never quite the same. The old lard was white and faintly sweet, and made a biscuit that rose beautifully in a hot oven, and had a crumb that was simultaneously flaky and tender in a way that no butter biscuit or shortening biscuit fully replicates. The technique was done mostly by feel, flour in a bowl, lard cut in with the fingertips until the mixture looked like rough crumbs, a well-made in the center, buttermilk poured in gradually, the dough brought together gently, just barely enough to hold. Handled too much, the biscuits went hard. Handled just right, they came out of the oven tall and golden, splitting apart naturally at the waist where the layers had formed. Eaten with gravy, with sorghum, with nothing at all, they were the small triumph of an ordinary morning, made from almost nothing, produced with skill that had been handed down so many times it no longer needed words. White gravy over everything in households where meat was scarce. The drippings left in the skillet after cooking whatever scant piece of pork or chicken had been available were never discarded. A little flour went directly into the hot fat, stirred quickly until it turned golden and smelled slightly nutty, and then milk, or water when milk was scarce, was whisked in slowly. The whole thing stirred constantly until it thickened to a pourable consistency. Salt, black pepper, sometimes a little more black pepper. What resulted was a white country gravy that could be poured over biscuits to make a complete meal, ladled over a bowl of plain boiled potatoes, spooned across a piece of cornbread. It extended everything it touched. A little meat became a lot of dinner when the drippings from it were turned into gravy and spread across enough biscuits to go around the table. Children didn't know they were eating poor. They knew they were eating gravy biscuits, and that felt like plenty. Salt pork and greens, the relationship between salt pork and bitter greens, is one of the oldest and most important in Southern cooking, and it is a relationship born entirely from poverty and practicality. Tough greens, collard, turnip tops, mustard, kale, need long cooking to become tender and lose their aggressive bitterness. A piece of salt pork, added to the pot at the beginning, gave the cooking liquid enough richness and salinity to balance the bitterness and create something that tasted intentional rather than desperate. The greens cooked down dramatically, losing most of their volume over the course of a long simmer. What remained in the pot was dense and savory and dark green, ladled into bowls alongside whatever starch was available. Families with a garden grew their own greens through most of the year. Even in winter, the tougher varieties, kale especially, collard stayed standing through frost, waiting to be picked. The combination of salt pork and whatever greens were still in the garden kept families fed through stretches when very little else was available. Dried corn pudding in late summer, before the corn dried fully on the stalk. Some was cut from the cob at its milky stage and dried slowly in the sun or in the low warmth of an oven that had been used for other baking and was still holding residual heat. This dried corn was then stored in jars or cloth sacks. Through winter, when fresh vegetables were only a memory, small amounts of it were reconstituted, soaked in water overnight, then cooked slowly, with a little milk, some butter or lard, salt, and sometimes a spoon of sugar, into a pudding that carried the genuine flavor of summer corn in a way that canned corn simply doesn't. It baked in a pan in the wood stove until it puffed and set, slightly golden on top. It was served as a side dish alongside beans or meat, but it could also stand alone as a meal when it needed to. The labor of preparing the dried corn in summer was understood as an investment in winter, and the families who put the work in then ate better in February. Bread pudding from stale bread that had gone hard didn't get thrown away. It got soaked, torn into rough pieces or left whole if the loaf had gone stale all at once. The bread went into a baking pan and was covered with a mixture of milk, or water and a small amount of milk, or just water in very lean times. Eggs, sugar, and whatever spice was on hand. Cinnamon and nutmeg were common, vanilla if there was any. The bread soaked up the custard mixture, softened back to something approaching tender, and then the whole pan went into the oven of the wood stove, where it baked until the top was set and the edges had gone slightly crisp, and the inside was soft and custardy and smelled warmly of spice. It was dessert and thrift at once, a transformation of something past its useful life into something genuinely pleasurable. Families that made bread pudding regularly developed strong opinions about the ratio of egg to milk, about whether raisins belonged in it, about whether it was better warm or cold the next morning. Oatmeal porridge, rolled oats, or the older steel-cut variety that took even longer to cook, were a reliable staple in pantries throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries because they were cheap. They kept indefinitely, and a small amount of them cooked into a large volume of food when stirred slowly into boiling water. Wood stove's back burner was made for oatmeal, a steady, gentle heat that coaxed the oats into a thick, smooth porridge without scorching them. Salted and eaten plain, it was a complete breakfast for a working family. Sweetened with molasses or honey or a little brown sugar, it became a comfort. Left to cool and then sliced and fried in a pan, like cornmeal mush, it became something else entirely. A savory fried cake with a crisp exterior that ate more like a substantial side than a breakfast food. Oatmeal was also used in bread, in cookies, as a binder for meatloaf when eggs were scarce. It went everywhere it was needed and asked for nothing in return. Pickled vegetables from the crock before refrigeration. The vegetable cellar and the pickle crock stood between a family and a winter of very poor eating. Cucumbers, beets, green beans, cabbage, onions. Anything that came out of the garden in abundance during summer was preserved in some form to see the family through the months when the ground was frozen and nothing grew. Pickling in brine or vinegar was among the most accessible preservation methods because it required only salt, water, and sometimes vinegar, a ceramic crock, and patience. A wooden plate weighted with a clean stone held the vegetables below the brine while they fermented. Weeks later, they were sharp and salty and alive in the way that fermented things are, and they provided something acidic and bright to cut through the monotony of winter cooking, the endless beans, the potatoes, the salt pork. A jar of pickled beets on the table could make a plain meal feel like it had variety. A dish of pickled cucumber beside a bowl of beans made the bowl of beans feel like less of a sacrifice. Pig ear stew. Pig ears went into the pot along with the other overlooked parts of the hog, the feet, the hocks, the tails, because nothing was overlooked when the hog was the primary source of meat protein for the year. Cleaned and simmered for several hours in salted water with aromatics, the ears softened enough to be eaten. Not fork tender the way a braised short rib might be, but genuinely edible, with a texture that was partly gelatinous, partly firm, the cartilage yielding eventually to the long cooking. Made into a stew with onions and tomatoes if the family had them, served over rice or with cornbread. The result was a dish that was frankly challenging for those who hadn't grown up with it and entirely natural to those who had. Families who ate this kind of food did so without ceremony and without apology. It was dinner. It kept the lights off hunger. That was enough. Bean cakes fried in a skillet. When there were leftover cooked beans, which, in households that kept a constant pot going, was most of the time, they were mashed with whatever was available. A fork, a potato masher, sometimes just wooden spoon pressing against the side of the pot until the beans broke down into a rough paste, seasoned with salt and pepper, shaped into flat patties, and laid into a skillet with a little hot lard. They fried into something crisp on the outside and creamy inside, filling enough to anchor a meal, flavorful enough to not feel like a compromise. Bean cakes used up the end of the pot without waste and stretched the cost of the original batch further. They could be made from any type of bean, took almost no time once the beans were already cooked, and didn't require the oven to be fired up, which saved fuel. In households managing a wood stove carefully, this kind of stovetop efficiency mattered enormously, adding up over the course of a week into real savings. Tomato gravy over biscuits when there was no meat for the drippings that ordinarily started a gravy, and no milk. Either some families made tomato gravy instead. Home-canned tomatoes, the jars lined up in the cellar from the previous summer's put-up, went into a pan with a little flour and lard or bacon grease, cooked down until they thickened and the raw flour taste cooked out of them, seasoned simply with salt and pepper, and sometimes a pinch of sugar if the tomatoes were very acidic. Poured over split biscuits, it was a complete meal in appearance if not always in abundance. The brightness of the tomato cut through the richness of the biscuit in a way that was genuinely satisfying. Children who grew up eating it often describe it as one of the foods they associate most specifically with their grandmother's kitchen, with a particular kind of morning light and a particular sound of a cast iron skillet, and a particular feeling of being fed with great care from very small means. Peanut soup in parts of the American South where peanuts were grown as a field crop, they also appeared in the kitchen in forms that have since become unusual. Peanut soup, made from peanuts ground to a rough paste or boiled whole until soft, simmered in water or a light broth with onions and a little seasoning, was a filling and protein-rich dish that cost almost nothing in areas where peanuts were grown locally and sold cheaply. It was thick and earthy and savory rather than sweet, nothing like the peanut butter sandwiches that a later generation would associate with peanuts. The soup had a depth to it that came from the natural oils in the peanuts working slowly into the cooking liquid. It was not a fashionable food. It wasn't the kind of thing that appeared on restaurant menus or in cooking magazines. It was kitchen food, family food, food that existed purely because it solved a problem and solved it well. Boiled peanuts. Before peanuts were roasted, before peanut butter, in the weeks just after harvest when the peanuts were still green, still holding moisture from the ground. They were boiled. A large pot of salted water, handfuls of freshly dug peanuts still in their shells, hours of simmering over the wood stove, or outside over a fire. What emerged from those shells was soft and almost creamy, thoroughly salted, with a flavor that was simultaneously familiar and entirely different from the roasted peanuts that most people know. Boiled peanuts were snack food, yes, eaten by hand, the shells cracked and discarded, the soft nuts inside popped directly into the mouth. But in households where they were available in abundance at harvest time, they were also dinner. Just that. A bowl of boiled peanuts and cornbread, and the family sat around the table and shelled them slowly, talking or not talking, and it was a meal that felt like an event even though it was nothing special at all. Sorghum and butter. On bread, sorghum syrup was not molasses, though people who didn't grow up with it often confuse the two. It was made from a grass grown specifically for its sweet juice, pressed, cooked down slowly in large flat evaporating pans until it thickened into a dark, amber syrup with a flavor that was earthy and complex and not quite like anything else. A jar of sorghum on the table was a standard feature of poor rural breakfasts and suppers across a wide swath of the South and Appalachia. Poured over a biscuit or a piece of cornbread, swirled together with a pat of butter, until the two combined into something richer than either alone. It was as much a meal as it was a condiment. Children came to associate its particular color, that dark amber. That caught the light when you held the jar up with safety and sufficiency. With enough sorghum and enough biscuits, family was fed. That was the calculation, and it usually worked out. Lentil and wild onion soup. Lentils were among the cheapest legumes available and among the most forgiving to cook. No soaking required, ready in 40 minutes to an hour over a steady fire, breaking down into a thick, substantial soup with very little help. Wild onions grew in fields and a long fence rose through much of rural America, available for the picking in early spring before gardens had anything worth harvesting. Gathered in small bunches and added to a pot of simmering lentils, along with salt and whatever dried herb had been put up the previous summer, they gave the soup a mild, fresh sharpness that was welcome after months of nothing but stored food. This was early spring cooking, hungry season cooking, the food of the weeks before the garden came in, and the stores from last year had run low. Lentils and wild onions required nothing from a store. They asked only for fire and water and time, and they fed people through the most difficult stretch of the year. And somewhere, right now, someone's grandmother is telling her grandchildren about the old kitchen, about the stove that had to be fed before anything else, about the way the whole house smelled on the days a pot of beans was going all day. And the grandchildren are half listening, the way young people half listen to things that feel too far away to matter yet. But one of them, maybe not today, maybe not for years, will find themselves standing in their own kitchen one cold evening, not quite sure what to make for dinner, and something will surface quietly in the back of their mind, a smell they didn't know they'd kept, a memory that doesn't quite belong to them but does, and they'll pull out a pot, and they'll start from the beginning,